At the edge of sundown, with red dust hanging in the air like old blood, Eli Mercer stood in the graveyard behind the church and told the men with shovels to leave the ground closed. "You can bury Thomas Reed," he said. "You are not burying his guns." The widow from the parsonage drew in a breath. Sheriff Boone shifted his hat back. One ranch hand muttered that grief had finally cracked the man clean through. Eli reached anyway for the weathered holster rig hanging over the pine box and lifted it with both hands. "Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. There is something good about knowing who is riding beside us in the dark." Thomas had worn those Colt revolvers for 15 years, one walnut grip scarred by a bullet groove, the other dark from sweat and trail dust worked so deep no oil ever drew it out. Half the town knew the guns better than they knew the man. Now he was lying under a Wyoming sky gone cold and hard as tin, and Eli was fastening Thomas's belt around his own waist with fingers that did not shake until the buckle bit leather. Boone said softly, "Best let the dead keep what's theirs." Eli looked down at the twin holsters riding low against his hips. Thomas had been bigger everywhere, louder too. Eli had always seemed made of fence wire beside him, all angles and silence. But the guns settled against him as if they belonged. "I made him a promise," Eli said. Nobody asked when. In Willow Creek, people respected grief right up to the moment it grew inconvenient. What none of them knew, not even Boone, was that Thomas had not died from whiskey, bad luck, or a drifter's bullet the way the story was already traveling through town. Thomas had died on the north line of the Bar L Ranch with his hand knotted in Eli's coat and blood soaking the sage, and his last clear words had been, "Don't let them take the guns, because if they take the guns, they bury the proof with me." Eli had spent 3 nights sleeping in a chair with those guns across his knees, waking at every stair creak and every whistle under the eaves, certain somebody would come through the dark to finish what had started on that ridge. As the mourners drifted off, Eli noticed a woman standing beyond the fence with a valise in one hand and a little girl pressed to her skirts. Her coat was too thin for the evening wind, and the hem was stiff with dried mud. She stood very straight, though, like she had learned long ago what happened when tired women let the world see them sway. The little girl stared at the guns on Eli's hips. The woman stared at the grave. Then she asked the question no one else had dared. "Who wants the proof buried?" The wind moved dry grass over Thomas's fresh mound. Eli felt the pull of both guns, heavy as a hand on either side. He had never seen the woman before, yet the sound of her voice carried no curiosity, only recognition, as if she already knew what powerful men did with dead truths. By full dark, the woman and the child were sitting in the back corner of May Haver's boarding house dining room with Stu between them. May had taken them in because she took in anything half-broken that crossed her threshold. She was a narrow woman with iron-gray hair and the habit of polishing the same spoon while listening to lies. She had given the stranger one look and said, "You can pay later if you stay honest." The woman said her name was Clara Vale. The girl was Ruthie, 6 years old, too solemn by half, with one missing front tooth and a way of watching doorways that did not belong on any child. Clara said she had been looking for Thomas Reed. At that, Eli set down his coffee cup without drinking. "You're late," May said. Clara's hand tightened on the spoon. "So I gathered at the graveyard." Ruthie looked up. "Mama said Mr. Reed was a good man." "He was," Eli said. Clara studied him then. "And you must be Eli Mercer." He did not ask how she knew. "Why were you looking for Thomas?" Clara reached into her valise and removed an envelope sealed in dark blue wax, now broken. She set it on the table. "My husband worked for Horace Latham," she said. That name changed the room. Horace Latham owned the Bar L, the freight office, half the mercantile, and enough debts in 3 counties to make men tip their hats from reflex. He donated hymnals to the church. He shook hands with judges. Clara went on. "My husband kept books in the freight office. He found shipments entered twice, cattle sold that didn't exist, land transfers signed by dead men. He tried to copy the pages. Then somebody broke 2 fingers in his right hand and told him accidents happened every day in this territory." She held up the envelope. "He wrote Thomas Reed because Thomas was the only man he knew who had once stood up to Latham in public and walked away breathing." Thomas wrote back, "We were meant to meet him here." Eli asked, "Where is your husband?" Clara looked at her daughter before answering. "Dead. Thrown from a train near Medicine Bow. according to the conductor who never looked me in the eye. May crossed herself. Eli felt the room tilt toward anger. And the proof. Clara nodded at the guns on his hips. Thomas wrote that if anything happened to him, he'd hide the ledger pages where no man would think to search. He said you would understand if you had to finish it. I think your friend left you a trail. There it was. The easy path and the hard one laid side by side on May Haver's scrubbed pine table. The easy path was plain enough. He could saddle before dawn, ride south alone, and vanish into any place where men seldom asked what drove a quiet cowboy away. Thomas would still be dead. Clara's husband would still be dead. Ruthie would still grow up learning that men with money got to write the last version of every story. But Eli would breathe. The hard path sat across from him with road dust on its hem and a child at its elbow. He opened the letter. If you're reading this, I either trusted the wrong man or ran out of time. The proof is split. One piece is in the place I told Eli never to look because he hates snakes. The rest is with the guns. Trust the woman, not the badge. There was only one place Thomas had ever forbidden Eli to search, and that was the old root cellar on the Reed place north of town. Eli drew one Colt halfway free. Then he saw it. The left grip panel had been replaced badly, one screw newer than the others. Thomas had done it in the last week, and Eli had missed it because grief makes fools of observant men. He slid the pistol back into place. Pack what you can carry, he said to Clara. May blinked. Tonight. Before word gets around, she came asking questions. Clara's face changed, not with relief, but with readiness. Where? Reed Place first. Then somewhere Latham's men won't expect. He looked at Ruthie. Can the girl ride? Ruthie lifted her chin. Better than my mother thinks. May disappeared into the kitchen and came back with wrapped biscuits, jerky, and the old Spencer carbine her late husband had kept above the pantry door. She handed it to Clara. You know how. Clara checked the lever. My father had daughters. He adjusted. Eli stood. The guns at his hips felt less like borrowed weight now and more like a sentence he had accepted. Thomas Reed had died believing Eli would do one difficult thing in a world full of easier cowardices. So he would. There is a point when a life turns not with thunder, but with the scrape of a chair leg on floorboards. Eli heard that scrape as Clara stood beside him with the carbine in her hands and Ruthie buttoned into May's old wool coat. If you had been in his place, would you have ridden out with them into the dark, knowing Latham owned half the roads ahead? Or would you have chosen breathing over bravery and left the dead to keep their secrets? The choice had been made. They went out the back. The night smelled of coal smoke, horse sweat, and snow not yet fallen. By the time hoofbeats sounded on the main street, they were already slipping north through the cottonwoods along the frozen creek. They reached the Reed place near midnight. Thomas had lived alone in a two-room house with a lean-to stable and a broken windmill. Frost silvered the porch rail. Eli tethered the horses and listened. Nothing. But nothing can be dangerous when men are hunting you. He took the lantern and headed for the root cellar. Clara stayed behind him with the Spencer ready. Ruthie waited inside the stable under strict orders not to move unless she heard Clara whistle twice. You truly hate snakes? Clara whispered. Only the breathing kind. Comforting distinction. Cold, damp air rolled up when he lifted the cellar door, smelling of dirt and stone. He held the lantern low and went down. In the far corner sat the biscuit tin Thomas had once used to cheat at cards. Eli opened it and found oilcloth wrapped around ledger pages and a little packet tied with red thread. Above him, a floorboard creaked. Clara's voice came sharp as a whip. Who is there? The answer was a gunshot. The lantern went out when Eli lunged for the stairs. In the black, earth walls seemed to close around him. He heard Ruthie scream from the stable, a horse rear, Clara fire once. Then he burst through the cellar door into moonlight and chaos. 3 riders. One down already, spilling from the saddle. Another behind the well, shooting blind. The third dragging Ruthie across the yard by the blanket, using the child as cover while he cursed at Clara to drop the rifle. Everything in Eli narrowed. He drew Thomas's left-hand Colt. The gun fit him like memory. Let her go, he said. The man behind Ruthie laughed. Eli fired once. The bullet took the rider through the throat, so clean the laugh broke in the middle and never finished. Ruthie dropped in the dirt and scrambled free. Clara shot the man by the well before he found a second aim. The third rider, wounded, kicked his mount toward the gate. Eli drew the other Colt and shouted after him. Tell Latham the guns were loaded with worse than lead. Tell him Thomas kept records. He fired into the fleeing man's shoulder, not to kill, but to mark the message deep. The rider disappeared into sage and dark, howling. Then there was only the ringing in Eli's ears, Ruthie crying, and Clara breathing hard with the rifle still shouldered. Eli knelt before the girl. "You hit anywhere?" She shook her head, tears making bright tracks through the dust. He smelled like cigars. Clara dropped to her knees and pulled Ruthie in so fast the child made a small startled sound before melting against her. Eli looked away, giving them 1 second's privacy in the wreck of the yard. It was enough. Latham had sent men willing to put hands on a child in open ground. Clara rose with dirt on her hem and fury, turning her face beautiful in a hard, dangerous way. "No more running," she said. Eli held up the oilcloth packet. "No. Now we finish it." Inside the house, by lamplight and with Ruthie asleep under Thomas's old buffalo robe, they laid the pages on the table. Freight receipts, cattle tallies, land claims, signatures repeated badly, some's altered. At the bottom of 2 pages sat notations in Thomas's blunt hand naming dates, wagon numbers, and the deputy clerk in Casper who had been paid to file fraudulent transfers. Tucked inside the red thread packet was a brass key and a note. "County lockbox. Boone knows where, if he still deserves to." Clara read that twice. "Your friend trusted the sheriff and didn't." "Thomas trusted nobody all the way," Eli said. "And Boone." Eli thought of the warning. "Trust the woman, not the badge." He thought of Boone at the graveyard telling him to let the dead keep what was theirs. Clara sat back, the lamplight catching the tired lines around her mouth. "We cannot outshoot a cattle baron and the men he pays." "No. Then we make him face people richer than he is. Judges, territory men, railroad partners, someone he can't buy cheaply." Eli tapped the brass key. "Thomas once drove a payroll box to the bank in Casper for Boone when the sheriff was laid up. If this opens what I think it opens, Latham hid originals somewhere official enough to survive him." Clara studied him. "You don't talk much until it matters, do you?" He looked at the guns on the table between them. "No use wasting words when work still needs doing." She softened. "My husband used to say quiet men either have nothing inside or far too much. Which am I?" She met his eyes. "I haven't decided." They left before dawn with the pages, the key, and 1 wounded enemy carrying news south. By noon, every rider on the Bar L would know Eli Mercer wore Thomas Reed's guns and was coming for the rest. Near the Sweetwater crossing, they found Sheriff Boone waiting by the cottonwoods with his horse drinking at the shallows. He held both hands visible. "I was hoping you'd choose this road." Eli did not dismount. "Thomas told me not to trust the badge." Boone nodded as if he'd expected the blow. "Then trust the man wearing it enough to hear him out." Latham's got riders combing the north trails and word sent ahead to every depot clerk between here and Casper. "If you stay on the open road, he'll catch you by dusk." Clara leveled the Spencer across her saddle horn. "And if we trust you, what then?" Boone looked at her, then at Ruthie. Shame moved across his face, slow and unmistakable. "Then I tell you what I should have told Tom 3 months ago. I knew Latham was buying claims off widows with forged papers. I told myself I needed proof. Truth is, I needed courage. Tom had more of it than me." Eli heard Thomas laughing in memory, bitter and warm at once. "How?" Eli asked. Boone pointed west. "Abandoned stage station 2 miles off the trail. Take the cut bank behind it to the telegraph spur. My sister runs the office in Rawlins. She'll wire Judge Sutter in Casper if I put my name to it. Latham can't silence all of us at once." Clara's eyes narrowed. "And what does this cost you, Sheriff?" He looked at the badge pinned to his vest. "About everything that deserves costing." Eli made his harder choice then. Not whether to fight. That had been settled in May's dining room. The harder choice was whether to risk faith in a bent man trying to stand straight. "Right ahead," he said. They reached the abandoned station by afternoon, and the storm found them there. Latham himself rode in before Boone's wire could be sent. Not with 100 men. With 8. Horace Latham came on a black gelding, wearing a city coat over trail boots and gloves the color of cream. He reined in across the yard and looked at Eli with something like paternal disappointment. "I had hopes for you," he said. "Tom Reed was always too noisy to live long. You, though, you understood the usefulness of minding your own patch of dust. Eli stood in the doorway of the station with Thomas's guns low on his hips and Clara behind the window rail with the Spencer. Boone had gone to the telegraph shack with Ruthie. Every minute mattered now. My patch keeps getting trampled by your boots, Eli said. Latham sighed. Give me the pages. Give me the key. I'll see the woman and child reach a train unharmed, and you may even keep breathing long enough to regret your friend. Clara called from inside. You murdered my husband. Latham turned his head just enough to answer without raising his voice. Your husband mistook numbers for virtue, Mrs. Vale. Then he looked back at Eli. Last offer. This was the true danger. Hand over the proof. Save the living. Call it prudence. Eli thought of Thomas on the ridge, blood in his teeth. He thought of Ruthie dragged by a blanket. He thought of Clara sitting upright in May's boarding house with widowhood still fresh enough to bleed through her voice. What would you have done in his place? Would you have trusted the bargain of a powerful man who had already killed to keep his secrets, if it meant the woman and child might live? Or would you have chosen the harder road and prayed it did not cost them everything? No, Eli said. Latham lifted one gloved finger. The shooting began. Glass burst inward. Wood spat splinters. Eli moved left and fired through the smoke. One rider dropped. Another horse screamed and bolted. Clara worked the Spencer with brutal calm. Boone's shotgun thundered from the rear shack, telling Eli the wire had either gone out or would not matter now. A rider reached the porch. Eli shot him through the chest at 3 paces. Another came through the side window boots first and caught Clara's rifle, but across the jaw before he hit the floor. She did not hesitate. She drove the carbine's muzzle into his throat and ended him with Eli's knife. Outside, Latham's men split wide, trying to fire the station from both sides. They're driving us from cover, Boone shouted. Then we move first, Eli answered. He went out the front into the open where Latham could see him. Bullets chewed dirt at his heels. Wind slapped his coat flat against his legs. He kept walking until Latham, certain pride had outrun sense, urged the black gelding closer. That was the mistake. Thomas's guns had not merely carried proof. They carried memory. The left Colt shot a hair low. The right kicked harder because of an old spring repair. Eli had watched Thomas use those quirks 100 times. Now he used them too. Left gun shattered Latham's wrist as the cattle baron reached for his own revolver. Right gun killed the man on Latham's flank. Eli closed the remaining distance before the others understood what was changing. Latham tried to turn his horse. Eli seized the bridle and yanked the gelding sideways into the trough. Horse and rider crashed in a spray of ice water and mud. Everything stopped for one breath. Latham lay half under the black gelding, one leg pinned, his city coat soaked dark at the sleeve, his face finally stripped of polish and showing the mean, frightened thing beneath. He clawed for the dropped revolver with his good hand. Eli stepped on it first. You don't get to write this ending, Eli said. Latham spat mud and blood. You think papers will matter? Men like me don't fall to papers. From the rear shack came the hard metallic chatter of the telegraph key still going, Boone's sister and Rollins answering back across the wire like fate clearing its throat. Clara emerged onto the porch with Ruthie behind her and the ledger pages held high. Her voice carried over the yard clear as bells. Maybe not, but witnesses help. Because while Latham had been watching guns, Boone had fired the station bell. The sound had carried across the winter flats to a freight team on the North Road and 2 homesteaders in the draw. They rode in now, then more behind them. Men who owed Latham money and men who hated him quietly. Power changes shape when enough people see it bleeding. Latham looked from one face to the next and understood. Not rescue. Not luck. Consequence arriving all at once. Boone came from the telegraph shack reloading with stiff, steady hands. Judge Sutter's on his way with territorial marshals from Casper. And for once in your life, Horace, they are coming for you. By dusk, Latham was in irons on the station porch. By dawn the next day, the deputy clerk in Casper was singing names to save his own neck. Within a week, the forged claims were voided, the fraudulent cattle sales exposed, and the Bar-L accounts frozen hard enough to crack every false thing Latham had built. His partners abandoned him. His bank called debts. His foreman turned evidence. By the time the trial opened in Cheyenne, Horace Latham had lost his land, his freight contracts, and his standing. Thomas Reed was buried again that Sunday, properly this time. Not because the first burial had been wrong, but because grief sometimes needs a second chance to say what fear interrupted. The whole town came. May brought pies no one touched until after the prayers. Boone stood bareheaded at the edge of the grave with his badge in his pocket instead of on his vest. Clara held Ruthie's hand. Eli wore Thomas's guns. Afterward, when the others drifted away, Clara found Eli by the fence line where the grass hissed against the posts. "You mean to keep them forever?" she asked. He touched one worn walnut grip with his thumb. "I used to think a promise was a thing you carried till it hurt too much. Then you set it down. Turns out some promises carry you." Clara's eyes shone, but did not spill over. She was too practiced for easy tears. "My husband had a line he used when the books wouldn't balance. He'd say, 'Truth waits, but it doesn't leave.' I hated him for sounding pleased about it." Eli did not know what to do with tenderness offered plain. It frightened him worse than rifle fire. Still, he said the truest thing he had. "I was no good at saving men I loved." Clara stepped closer until the space between them held only winter and choice. "Maybe," she said softly, "you were meant to get good at staying for the living." He bowed his head once, because some mercies are too large to meet straight on. Then Ruthie came running through the grass with a ribbon she'd found and demanded Clara tie it to one of the fence posts for Thomas so he would not be lonely where he was. Clara did. Eli watched their two heads bend together in the thin gold light, and something long boarded up inside him let in air. That was the quiet after the storm. No miracle. Just a woman with a tired face, a brave child in cold sunlight, and a lonely man realizing the world had handed him back more than it had taken. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who it was written for. A like and a subscribe tell us to keep bringing these endings into the night. Spring found them in a small house west of town. Eli fixed the roof. Clara took over the keeping of every paper and penny within 3 miles because the county suddenly discovered a powerful affection for honest figures. Ruthie grew louder, as children will when safety begins to feel believable. Boone won back enough respect to keep the office, though he wore it humbler. May kept feeding whoever needed feeding and pretending it was temporary. The gun stayed on Eli's hips. Years passed, not swiftly, the way they do in careless stories, but honestly. With blizzards and drought and rain. With work. With arguments over nothing. With coffee gone cold because children do not care about coffee. With nights Clara woke from old grief and found Eli awake from his until pretending became unnecessary. When he finally married her, 3 months after realizing the whole town had assumed it already, he wore Thomas's guns to the church, and Boone laughed aloud at the sight of it. But Thomas stayed with them in the way the dead worth loving always do. Inside habit, inside story, inside the shape of a life changed because they once stood in it. Eli never buried the guns because they were witness, warning, and inheritance. A reminder that loyalty is not proved by dying for a man once, but by living in a way that keeps his best truth from going under. When Eli Mercer died at 83 with Clara's hand in his and Ruthie's grown daughter weeping openly at the foot of the bed, Thomas Reed's gun belt hung on the bedpost, where it had hung every night for 42 years. Near the end, he touched the worn walnut grip and smiled, as if hearing a joke from the next room. After the house went quiet, Clara carried the guns to the porch before dawn. The world smelled of wet earth and lilac. Beyond the yard, their grandson was mending fence while the sun lifted over the pasture in long copper bands. She set the holster rig across the porch rail and rested both hands on it for a moment. Then she said, "To the man gone and the man remembered and the life that had held them both, the faithful are never truly buried. They keep rising in the people who love them." A little later, when the light had turned the fields to brushed gold and the kitchen window behind her glowed warm with morning, the old gun shone softly above the pasture where 3 generations were already moving through the day. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman sent to a remote ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who saw her worth from the moment she arrived.